Hi guys, I'm Maya. For those of you who don't remember me from the last time you guys saw me in week 2 for the John Berger presentation. But today I'll be talking about Salvador Dali's The Elephants and how the painting questions ideas of stability and authority through the way that Dali combines strength with fragility. And rather than just simply like creating a dreamlike image, Dali painted a scene where what we would expect from the image doesn't quite work the way it should. And the painting's subjects, the elephants, they look stable at a first glance, but the longer and the closer you look at it, the more that stability becomes less stable. And my essay focuses on how Dali creates that feeling visually through distorted proportions, surreal space, and symbolic imagery. So first, I just wanted to begin with the painting itself. And at a first glance, the elephants are enormous within the space. They have obelisks on their back, which are traditionally connected to endurance and authority and permanence. And the scale of these animals kind of immediately creates this sense of dominance within the composition. And then once you look at the legs, though, everything about that seems to change that idea, as their bodies kind of look really heavy and grounded, but the legs are so impossibly thin and elongated to the point that they kind of resemble stilts rather than actual limbs capable of supporting all the weight that we intrinsically know about the elephants. This, coupled with the fact that the joints are bending in these impossible ways, the image kind of feels more unstable, even though the elephants themselves are still standing. And Dali also isolates the elephants within the environment, as the horizon line sits very low and the empty landscape around them doesn't really provide much visual support. And thus, instead of grounding the elephants within the space, the background makes them feel even more suspended to the point as if they were floating, but they're not. And that disconnect kind of between the two is one of the main ideas of this painting. So my argument is that Dali combines strength and fragility within the same image in order to question how authority works. The elephants are physically imposing, but structurally they can't really logically exist or make sense, as they suggest, like I said, endurance and strength and control, while their legs are suggesting weakness and instability and struggle. And because of that, the painting implies that authority depends less on actual structural security, and more on the perception of that structural security. The elephants remain standing because they look like they're capable of standing, even though that support system is unreliable. And I also argue that Dali uses that visual instability to question whether ideas like permanence, power, and authority are inherent versus whether they depend on people continuing to believe in them to give them that feeling of permanence and power. One thing I focus on pretty heavily in my essay is the way that Dali paints these distorted elephants with an extreme level of realism. He's rendered very clearly with the skin, the shadows, the lighting, and the texture all feeling very believable and highly controlled. This painting appears photographic in certain ways due to that level of realism, especially in the way that the elephants themselves and the vivid colors of the sky really just pop out. That realism comes really important because it makes the distorted anatomy even feel more disturbing to the viewer because they look so real. They look like real elephants that exist in a space. If the painting were more loose or abstract, everything visually contradictory or wrong about the image wouldn't feel as convincing. Hence the fact that Dali painted the image with such precision while simultaneously breaking its subject's physical structure. And this way of working is called veristic surrealism, which is using highly realistic depictions of impossible or irrational scenes to create something very unsettling to look at. And this form of surrealism is what Dali is most widely known for. And in my essay, I also reference Eric Shanes, who explains that Dali creates sharp visual contrast to what he describes as furious precision. And that precision intensifies the stability within the painting because the elephants look realistic enough that they could be real, like I said, but they fail to do this in a logical manner, which kind of causes this weird cognitive dissonance with the viewer. And I also discuss how the legs disrupt the viewer's sense of certainty because the legs failing to provide that visual sense of believable support. And so stability kind of feels imposed rather than natural, like one would expect from an animal like an elephant, who normally have very thick and sturdy legs meant to support their several hundreds or thousands of pounds of weight. And this painting was partially inspired by Bernini's elephant and obelisk structure in Rome. Bernini's sculpture, of course, shows that same kind of imagery, the elephant as stable and grounded with an obelisk on its back, and the relationship between the elephant and its obelisks are balanced, so the structure is, of course, physically believable. And the weight above, seems fully supported by the weight underneath it. And the thing is, though, Dali takes that concept and flips it completely on its head. Because unlike Bernini's work, Dali's elephants still carry obelisks on their back, but rather than having that support and that groundedness from that visual balance, they look like they could snap at any minute. And still, though, the animals remain standing despite that pressure that they look like they're about to snap. In my essay, I discuss how this changes the original symbolism, as Bernini's sculpture reinforces stability and strength, while Dali uses that same imagery for challenging stability and strength. Considering what was happening in Europe at the time Dali painted this, it's interesting that he challenges presenting authority as a secure, natural fact of life, and rather presents it as something that appears secure and natural only because it hasn't yet collapsed in on itself. So, in Europe, during the time that Dali created his work, the Soviet blockade of Berlin occurred. And during this crisis, Soviet forces blocked railroads, roads, and water access to Allied controlled areas of Berlin. And although governments and political systems at this time still projected their authority onto the people, ironically, many of those systems were operating under extreme strain after the end of the Second World War. And I discussed in my essay how this period created uncertainty surrounding political control and stability throughout Europe. And nations operated as organized and secure, but beneath that were these really fragile conditions, political division, and growing conflict between East and West Germany. And just, this crisis obviously very closely connects back to Dali's elephants, because like the political systems of the post-war period, the elephants present as stable at the moment while depending on structures that are wholly unreliable with time. Their legs are symbolic of these fragile political foundations, and the animals stand, for now, but there's still that constant sense that they could collapse at any given moment. I also discuss how the elephants are traditionally associated with endurance, wisdom, and strength, and Dali keeps those associations somewhat intact, but he distorts them through the proportions of the animals. With the distortion, the symbolism kind of has an altered meaning, one that mirrors, in a way, the Soviet blockade of Berlin. And the painting challenges that idea of authority being a guarantee, whether it survives because people continue to accept stability in the form of authoritative power because that's what they feel is powerful. So kind of overall, the elephants is an image that's stable while also weakening stability at the same time. Dali combines realistic detail with distorted anatomy in order to create figures that look convincing but unreliable at the same time. And through those distorted proportions, surreal space, and historical associations, the painting effectively challenges whether authority is truly permanent or whether it depends on perception and continued belief. By the end of my critical analysis of the painting, what we may think originally about the work changes completely. Instead of just being a classic surrealist dreamscape, it feels constructed and fragile and capable of showing what too much pressure on an unstable support system has the potential to do. And thank you for listening. And here's just my works cited. And I just wanted to anticipate and answer some potential questions that might have come up. So why did I choose The Elephants by Dali? And I chose The Elephants because it was, in my opinion, the perfect blend between visually interesting art and modern art, as I generally do not like modern art. I just prefer the ancient forms of art, from several hundred to several thousands of years ago. And on top of that, as an illustrator myself, I prefer making highly rendered and highly detailed art. So Dali's highly detailed and highly rendered art really aligns with what I personally enjoy making myself. Not to mention, this piece specifically can be interpreted in many ways, which gave me more freedom to kind of really explore what each of those meanings could have. Why did I think the painting has political connotations, and why did I connect it to the Soviet blockade? I felt that the painting was in itself political, of course, but not in the sense that it just references one specific event. But I do think that the historical context of 1948 adds another layer to the painting, because during that post-war period, like I said, many systems of authority were acting stable when they weren't necessarily stable in reality. And I connected to the blockade because it happened during the same time that the painting happened to be created. And ironically, it reflected that perfect instability that I had kept referencing throughout my work. And furthermore, this kind of context of a system of power outwardly displaying that power and authority and permanence while being fundamentally flawed and fragile can be applied to many, many, many events, past and present. And this is just an important notion to keep in mind as we move through life as adults after leaving SCAD. What makes this work surrealist, and what's the difference between regular surrealism and veristic surrealism? So surrealism in and of itself was an art movement of the 20th century, of course, focused on the unconscious, using various methods to get past rational thought in work. Veristic surrealism is more specific within that genre, as artists like Dali used hyper-realistic and nearly photographic rendering to create realistic dreamscapes. Unlike, of course, other types of surrealism like automatism, which focused more on the unconscious through free-flowing abstractions. And Dali combined realistic painting techniques with impossible imagery, hence he is known most notably for his work in veristic surrealism. And for those of you wondering the visual difference between the two, we have these right here. On the left is one of Dali's most famous works with the melting clocks, of course. And then on the right, we have an example of automatism surrealism with Regia Marinho. I don't know if I said that correctly, but they do more abstract forms of surrealism. And that's kind of like the visual difference between the two. And anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation and my topic, and I hope you guys learned something. Thank you.